Hello, honeys. Hope you had a wonderful Labor Day weekend. I particularly enjoyed my time in Cincinnati myself, but we're not here for the chit-chat. We're here for the Beesness, your recap of Arts World headlines from August 24th through the 30th. Before we begin for the day, we wanted to remind you that if you're at all interested in learning more about how things work behind the scenes here at Highbrow Honey, how I operate and think as an art historian, what I do when I'm collecting artworks, we have 3, soon to be 4 articles posted about that on our Substack. For all your written content needs, please feel free to check us out at highbrowhoney.com/Substack. With a quick reminder that we have linked all of our sources for today in a separate document available in the episode description. We'll get started. Opening here with our follow-ups first, questions have surfaced as of last week about why eco-activists have received years in prison for only $588 in damages. A Freedom of Information request from Novara Media revealed that the London National Gallery's head of framing, Peter Shade, or maybe Sade, estimated the cost of retouching the frame of Van Gogh's 1888 painting Sunflowers, a victim of the activist group Just Stop Oil's Soupings, at approximately £150 or $203. The same media outlet reported as well that the museum spent an additional approximately £250 or about $338 restoring the wall it was hanging on, plus about $47 or £35 for paint, totaling the about $558 for all damages. As you may recall, we have reported on these soupings in the past. They did make global headlines, and even though the painting was protected by thick security glass, social media and admittedly I reacted very strongly to this climate crisis protest. A few things stand out, however, regarding that case. When reporting on the sentencing in September 2024, for example, the BBC said that the pair caused £10,000 worth of damage to the frame of the glass-covered painting in what they characterize as a quote-unquote attack. However, they provided no evidence or source for their estimate. Furthermore, the presiding judge, Christopher here, quote, known for his harsh stance on climate activism, end quote, and Hyperallergic's words, ruled that the value of the damage was irrelevant for the jury, so its members never heard these actual figures. The activists were found guilty and received a combined 3.5-year sentence. So, honeys, we are now seeing these headlines, these questions about whether or not justice has actually been served as we look back upon what happened. Human rights lawyer Abhinav Tyagi has written about the 5 alleged legal missteps in the sentencing of these eco-activists, and Pussy Riot member Nadia Tolokonikova, who has been featured in other business stories of ours, wrote in the activist pair's defense in a Guardian piece, quote, "Nature was Van Gogh's ultimate muse. He loved it, as do Phoebe Plummer and Anna Holland. I believe he would have approved of Phoebe and Anna's actions, it belonging to the tradition of activists and artists defying norms to create a new, better world," end quote. Ultimately, why we care is this story highlights the arguments in the arts world and beyond over what counts as peaceful protest versus violent crime. And our sources believe that these debates over proportional sentences and protest rights will likely continue alongside museum protests and the recent attention they've had. Quote, "One may argue that the cases of eco-protests at museums were the canary in the coal mine for the larger Gaza protests that have since followed, since many of the same issues outlined by Tyagi are more relevant than ever," end quote. We also learned that Trump has met with the Smithsonian's leader amid threats of content reviews. According to the New York Times, he and Lonnie Bunch, secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, had lunch together Thursday, which our sources see as suggestive that even as the president continues to target its museums in official mandates, White House communications, and social media posts, the Trump administration and the museum entity are in communication. This meeting is noteworthy because the two do not have a good past. Bunch has denounced Trump's behavior, especially regarding the history of enslavement in the West, in his own 2019 memoir, and the Times report did not feature the details about what topics were actually discussed over lunch. All we know is that a White House representative told the Times that the meeting was, quote, productive and cordial, end quote, while Smithsonian spokespeople did not respond to requests for comment. As far as sales, auctions, and events goes, we learned that Barbara Gladstone's Chelsea townhouse in New York City sold for $13.1 million US. The late and prominent gallerist who rose up in the 1980s New York art scene passed at age 89 after a brief illness. Her international namesake gallery has a roster full of celebrated names like Joan Jonas, Wangechi Mutu, Keith Haring, Robert Rauschenberg, Carrie Mae Weems, Arthur Jaffa, etc. And the property itself was purchased by an unnamed buyer in an all-cash deal which closed on August 27th. The 5-bed, 19th century brick Greek Revival townhouse went for more than $1 million above its asking price. Last week also saw the sentencing of an Egyptian antiquities trafficker after a failed smuggling attempt at JFK Airport. Ashraf Omar El-Darir, an Egyptian doctor who was arrested 5 years ago for importing hundreds of artifacts into the U.S. without declaring them on customs forms, was sentenced to 6 months in prison by U.S. District Judge Rachel P. Kovner on August 27. An investigation launched after his 2019 arrest recovered over 600 Egyptian artifacts transported to the U.S. on flights from Cairo to JFK in New York in 2019 as well as early 2020. El-Darir pled guilty to 4 counts of smuggling Egyptian artifacts in February of this year, and the U.S. Attorney's Office called him a, quote, prolific trafficker, end quote, of ancient Egyptian artifacts, likely because each of the 4 times he smuggled artifacts into the U.S., he used fake paperwork, fake provenances to sell those artifacts at U.S.-based auction houses. A press release from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York reads in part, quote, those who steal cultural treasures of other countries and smuggle them into the United States should know that they will be held accountable for their crimes, end quote. Another headline announced that a Colorado town has settled with a Native American artist in a controversy over a pro-Palestine painting. The town of Vail had canceled Hunkpapa Lakota painter Danielle Seawalker's Art in Public Places artist residency and mural creation last year after she shared an unrelated painting in support of Palestine on her Instagram. The town publicly stated at the time that it removed Seawalker from the project because it would, quote, not use public funds to support any position on a polarizing geopolitical issue, end quote, and the ACLU of Colorado sued on her behalf for violation of First Amendment rights. As of last week, the civil rights lawsuit is settled, with the municipality agreeing to several concessions that the artist sees as advantageous for going beyond a financial result and allowing her to secure programming that other artists might benefit from. These include the municipality funding an art program, quote, for underrepresented and economically disadvantaged people, end quote, them hosting a powwow led by Seawalker every year for the next 5 years, and a, quote, commitment by Vail to sponsor a community forum on Israel and Palestine that would include interfaith leaders and host an annual Indigenous-led cultural sensitivity training for employees of the municipality's Arts and Public Places Department, end quote. No one from the ACLU of Colorado nor the Town of Vail spokespeople have responded to sources for comment on this. I do agree with Seawalker, though. It does seem more beneficial to have a future of programming events rather than a one-time and rather solitary financial gain result from this situation. We also learned last week that a Pennsylvania art museum has sued the Trump administration over a canceled IMLS grant. The Woodmere Art Museum in Philadelphia filed on August 26 over the unlawful termination of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, says Bloomberg Law, more specifically the loss of a $750,000 grant awarded to its historic preservation program for collection, digitization, and conservation. The suit alleges that Trump officials undermined Congress's authority to distribute federal funds by prematurely terminating said funds, and wrote in its complaint that Woodmere, quote, has been scrambling ever since, end quote, to complete its forthcoming America 250 exhibitions following the 2024 grant's termination in April. Because grant reimbursements are distributed quarterly, Woodmere only got about $195,000 before the loss of it. The museum is seeking an injunction to stop IMLS and the Office of Management and Budget from following the March executive order which ended its grant, as well as the IMLS itself, as the museum is already on the hook for several work contracts related to this grant project. And that's what I wanted to highlight about this story, is that it embodies the very real consequences for specific arts and humanities institutions who have suffered as a result of the rescinding of all this funding. And the IMLS has already been to court several times this year. In May, when a coalition of states brought a lawsuit against the funding cuts and were met with a preliminary injunction to stop the layoffs. In June, when the Government Accountability Office determined that the Trump administration's withholding of IMLS funds was illegal, and a federal judge ruled against the stopping of fund slashing. And in August, which saw a court filing that, quote, IMLS employees were informed that the reduction in force notices were rescinded, end quote. Check out any of our Beesnesses from those months for more details on those stories. And a quick reminder that the agency itself, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, is facing the possibility of federal defunding if the Trump administration's proposed 2026 fiscal budget is approved by Congress. The proposed remaining allocation of only $6 million would be used to close the agency Agency, and several others at the beginning of 2026. Across the pond, the FITA campaign group also threatened Lister University with legal action for its trans-inclusive museum guidelines. The group, known as Freedom in the Arts, is threatening to sue over the publication of quote-unquote misleading guidance on furthering transgender inclusion in museums and galleries by the university's Research Center for Museums and Galleries Department 2 years ago. FITA has also demanded that these guidelines be deleted from the university's websites immediately. Notably, 22 cultural and heritage groups supported the guidelines, including the International Council of Museums UK and the Association of Independent Museums. Some even refused to give comments to the art newspaper about FITA efforts, but one, a museum consultant who specializes in inclusive practice named Margaret Middleton, criticized the group for, quote, defending gender-critical speech, end quote, and the promotion of, quote, transphobic, end quote, talking points. FITA's main complaint/claim is that the university's guidelines misrepresent the definition of sex under the UK's Equality Act of 2010 and thereby defies the UK Supreme Court's decision earlier this year, which ruled that, quote, woman and, quote, sex in the Equality Act refer only to biological women and biological sex. The group additionally pointed to its own recent survey results, titled Afraid to Speak Freely, which found that 84% of the included 483 arts workers rarely or never feel able to express their views publicly, particularly on issues around sex and gender, due to their fear of professional consequences, but it was still rejected by the university for quote-unquote guideline review help back in July. But it does not appear that the data from that survey tells the whole story, as thousands in the arts community, especially in the UK, have expressed support for trans inclusion. Quote, over 2,000 cultural workers have signed an open letter defending trans rights, stating they would not police toilet use, end quote. Faculty and staff members are questioning the administration's decision to lay off 9 administrative employees in July, 5 unionized workers and 4 non-union workers, while claiming in a school-wide message that CalArts needed to cut expenses. You may recall tensions were already high at the school because of the recent unionization of about 600 workers in March of this year. Sometime during the same spring, CalArts sent voluntary separation and early retirement notices to union leader estimated 50 to 60 faculty and staff, but only 32 employees took the school's offer. Still, President Ravi Rajan moved ahead with the layoffs despite heated union objections. The remaining employees are drawing all the attention they can to this situation, these layoffs, arguing that they could harm the school's ability to train and nurture the next generation of artists. We also decided to feature this story as the future of the school seems very up in the air, with financial insecurity being used as a justification for these layoff actions, yet up until very recently, the fiscal insecurity of the school was frequently and publicly denied. These remaining employees are raising the question of whether the school is actually in financial danger or not. Another significant headline from last week, the world's largest Van Gogh collection is facing an uncertain future. In an August 27th press release, Amsterdam's Van Gogh Museum said it would be forced to shutter for good if the Dutch Ministry of Education, Culture and Science chooses not to provide an additional $2.9 million to its $10 million annual subsidy needed to pay for fixes and upgrades to its climate control, elevator, fire safety, and security systems. The Dutch government is saying that these costs are on the museum, who has filed a legal complaint that the state, in turn, is in violation of its founding 1962 agreement between the Vincent van Gogh Foundation, established by the artist's nephew, and the Dutch government to, quote, ensure the material preservation of the collections as if they were its own property, end quote. The Dutch Ministry of Culture says that the museum's funding amount is calculated with the same methodology that all Dutch national museums are and already receives, quote, one of the highest subsidies per square meter, end quote, out of all of them. Amsterdam's Van Gogh Museum houses over 200 paintings and roughly 500 drawings by the Dutch master, but a report published by an independent committee last year confirmed that the building is in poor shape. The Van Gogh Museum's director, Emile Gordenker, told the New York Times, quote, if this situation persists, it will be dangerous for the art and dangerous for our visitors. This is the last thing we want, but if it comes to that, we would have to close the building, end quote. Our sources confirmed that the case will hit the courts February 19th of 2026. In exciting archaeology news, royal sculptures from a 2,000-year-old sunken city were lifted out of the sea off Alexandria last week. The artifacts in question were hoisted from a submerged archaeological site in Abu Qir Bay August 21st. Egyptian officials then told Agence France Presse that the area may may be part of the long-lost seaport Canopus, a prominent trade, religious, and luxury hub that flourished during Egypt's Ptolemaic dynasty, as well as the Roman Empire, but was eventually drowned and crumbled by rising sea levels and continuous earthquakes. These couple thousand-year-old relics include stone anchors, a harbor crane, remains of a merchant ship, pieces of limestone buildings, marble and granite royal statues, although our sources explain that while much more is underwater, only specific material meeting strict criteria can be brought back to land for the Alexandria National Museum collections. The headline also leads us to an important and relevant tangent. Alexandria is as vulnerable to rising sea levels as its ancient predecessors. In fact, quote, the United Nations estimates that at least a third of the historic city will be underwater or uninhabitable by 2050, displacing 1.5 million of its 6 million residents, end quote. Last week also saw the Smithsonian's Latino Gallery quietly close for 9 months. The temporary space for the National Museum of the American Latino of the last 3 years, the National Museum of American History's Molina Family Latino Gallery, closed ahead of schedule in preparation for America's 250th programming and as the Trump administration focuses on Smithsonian content at large. This also means that the organization's exhibition, Presente, A Latino History of the United States, was shuttered on July 20th, 4 months sooner than expected. Concern over the closure rose, our sources say, especially as several featured artists came forward to tell our sources that they had not been notified in advance of this closure. A spokesperson for the Smithsonian said, quote, the National Museum of the American Latino is participating in the Smithsonian's celebration of the nation's 250th anniversary and wanted to meet the spring 2026 deadline for opening its planned future exhibition in support of the Smithsonian's institution-wide plans, end quote. Yet, our sources note that this spokesperson did not directly answer a question about whether Trump's museum reviews or executive actions have influenced this closure decision, and that the institution, quote, reportedly adopted the salsa-themed 250th exhibition as a softer alternative to a planned exhibition on Latino youth movements that garnered significant conservative backlash, end quote. Either way, honeys, the timing of this shutdown ensures that the gallery will be closed throughout Hispanic Heritage Month this fall. It is also an atypical, aka foreboding, stretch of inactivity for the fledgling National Museum of the American Latino's only current physical gallery. One such artist who was featured in Presente and not given notice about its closure in advance, Felipe Galindo Gomez, is quoted by our sources saying, I know art is very powerful and makes people ponder. That's the idea. It's not threatening, it's very disheartening to see this from people who are in power, end quote. We also heard last week that the Anonymous Was a Woman organization and the New York Foundation for the Arts have recently awarded over $500,000 in environmental art grants. 29 projects led by women identifying artists from across the U.S. and its territories whose work addresses ecological concerns will receive grants of up to $20,000 U.S. apiece as the 2025 recipients of funds from this 3-year-old environmental grants program. The grand total of all funds distributed will be $521,125. Selected projects will have additional public engagement components to be completed by August of 2026. The winners were chosen from among a pool of just over 1,000 applicants and include artists with projects located in Guam, Mexico, Nigeria, Senegal, South Korea, as well as in the U.S. The group known as Anonymous Was a Woman was founded in 1996 and has historically funded work by women identifying artists aged 40 and up. It has dispersed more than $10 million U.S. in unrestricted grants to date. Founder and artist Susan Unterberg stated, quote, we are living in a time of multiple crises, but we must not be overwhelmed or paralyzed from taking action. Environmental action is more urgently needed than ever before, and artists have a powerful role to play in helping us see, feel, and respond to the crises around us. These projects remind us that art can be both a call to action and a source of hope at a time when both are essential, end quote. And our last story for the day, honeys, headlines announced that a dust storm blew away a Ukrainian artwork at the most recent Burning Man. The monumental work, titled Black Cloud, was intended to be, quote, a visual metaphor for the impending threat of war, end quote, and was destroyed within hours of installation on Ukraine's Independence Day of August 24th. By some accounts, the artwork didn't last more than 15 minutes despite its heavy-duty materials. The 50-foot artwork consisted of 45 interconnected blow-up forms with flashing strobes and a continuous soundscape created from real snippets of audio of warfare in Ukraine. But it was no match for the powerful dust storm's 50-mile-an-hour winds. That same storm has reportedly resulted in at least 4 minor injuries at Burning Man's so far, and news of this storm comes only 2 years after torrential rainfall transformed the Desert Cultural Festival into an enormous mud pit. The team behind Black Cloud has confirmed that the installation is slated to be rebuilt for a European tour despite the damage, though the dates and locations of that have not yet been announced. And there, honeys, is your buzz for the week. Now, honeys, you may have noticed that this episode finally actually was 20 minutes or so, and that's because I'm trying a slightly different approach to constructing our Beesness episodes. If you think it's working, please let us know by dropping a comment wherever it is you listen, by following our podcast or subscribing to our channel, and otherwise engaging with this episode so I know you've listened and enjoyed it. With that said, we'll sign off for the day. Hydrate or dihydrate. Take care of yourselves. We'll talk very soon, honeys. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.